Hey guys, I'm in a different part of my room from usual. My chair is killing me, so I just figure I'll do the video lesson from here. So this is uh this is the other side of my room, the part that you guys don't usually see when I'm by my bookcase. Um, so let's get started. We're gonna mostly talk today in the video about the Korean War, um, juniors. Before we get to that, we're going into the 1950s, so the Cold War is still raging. China was just lost to the communists, and this is something that is angered a lot and worried a lot of Americans. President Truman is blamed for losing China, and the thing is that you could argue that that's the reason why he decided to take as hard a line in Korea as he did. Because remember, it's only a year after the communists took control over China. But before we get to that, let's talk about something else that happened in 1950. NSC 68 was published. It was a Defense Department document that basically laid out what the situation was with the Soviet Union and some ways that the United States could deal with it. The NSC 68 said the Soviet Union was aggressive, greedy, and strong, and they proposed a whole bunch of things that the United States should do in order to counter the Soviet threat. They urged an expansion of U.S. nuclear weapons. They said there should be more CIA or covert action taken against unfriendly governments around the world, whatever that means, right? And also, it said the United States should put no limit on its defense spending. Basically, we should spend whatever it takes in order to counter the Soviet Union. So by the end of 1950, after NSC 68 was published, defense spending had tripled to the point where by 1953, two-thirds of the entire federal budget went to defense spending. The U.S. nuclear stockpile was quintupled to 750 nuclear weapons after NSC 68 was published. And also, the United States increased military aid to anti communist governments around the world. So the suggestions made by NSC 68 were taken by the United States government. For that last part, that the United States provides military aid to anti-communist governments, that became a slippery slope, as we know. The United States wound up supporting almost any government around the world that just was saying that it was anti-communist or was fighting leftists, and that meant the United States wound up supporting a lot of repressive, pretty awful governments around the world in the name of fighting communism. So the thing is that that policy continued until good into the 1980s, where the United States pretty much supported anybody who was against the communists, and that led to some unsavory dealings that the United States wound up undertaking, all in the name of fighting communism. Now, let's start talking about the Korean War. The Cold War first became a hot war in Korea, in the Korean Peninsula. Now, I'm going to leave you guys at the bottom of this video. I'm going to leave you guys a map, a series of maps that just kind of show what the Korean Peninsula looked like starting in 1950 and over the course of the Korean War up until 1953, which is and that map of Korea from 1953 is still the way the Korean Peninsula looks to this day. Now, after World War II, Korea was divided in two. North Korea was controlled by the communists. South Korea was a non-communist government that had the support of the United States. Interestingly, I took a class about Korea a few years ago, and they had, well, probably more than a few years ago now, but they taught me a bunch of things I didn't know. Like, for instance, North Korea actually had been before the communist takeover, North Korea had actually been the more industrialized part of Korea and the more Christian part of Korea, while South Korea was more Buddhist and more rural, which just surprised me because now we know South Korea is a booming Western style democracy with a Western style economy, right? Hyundai and LG, and they have a lot of companies whose products that we buy all the time. But it was reversed before the end of World War II, where the North was the more industrialized part and the South was the more rural part. So North Korea was communist, South Korea was not communist. Now the 38th parallel was the boundary between North Korea and South Korea. And on June 25th, 1950, North Korea, the communist country, invaded South Korea with Joseph Stalin's blessing. There always had been some controversy about that, whether Stalin and the Russians actually had been in cahoots with the North Koreans, telling them to invade. Well, KGB documents that have been declassified since the fall of the Soviet Union actually have confirmed that yes, Stalin actually did give Kim Il Sung and the communists the go ahead to invade South Korea. So here we have a communist country invading a non-communist country. So here the containment policy and the Truman Doctrine were being tested in as profound a way as possible. So Harry Truman actually said after North Korea invaded South Korea, quote, "Korea is the Greece of the Far East. If we are tough on them there, they won't take any further steps." So again, here containment and the Truman Doctrine was being tested for the first time. And Truman, remember, was a hardline anti-communist, and he was still being blamed for losing China the year before. So Truman ordered U.S. air and naval forces to the Korean Peninsula. Now, the United States Congress never declared war on North Korea, but what Truman did was he went to the United Nations and asked the UN to authorize a police action against the North Koreans. Now, I know what you're thinking, doesn't the Soviet Union have a veto in the UN? They do, but the Soviet Union, for a variety of other reasons, had been boycotting the UN. So Truman and the Americans took advantage of the Soviet boycott of the United Nations to actually get the UN to give its blessing to a police action led by the United States to kick the communists out of South Korea. So technically, the Korean War was a UN police action, not an official war. Now, Douglas MacArthur, the hero of World War II, the man who "I shall return," remember he said after the Japanese kicked him out of the Philippines, and had also basically reconstructed Japan in the years after the war. Douglas MacArthur is an acclaimed military hero, beloved by many, many Americans, particularly conservative Americans, and he was made commander of UN forces. Now, how is he going to actually get the communists out of South Korea? So there were some initial setbacks when MacArthur and the U.S. military actually, got to the Korean Peninsula. But MacArthur finally devised an ingenious plan for an amphibious landing at Incheon, which is 150 miles behind enemy lines. So basically, it was a rearguard action through the sea to actually the communists. So it was a rearguard action to try to take them on, and it was a success. Within a couple of months, MacArthur was successful in pushing the communists out of South Korea and getting them to the 38th parallel, which remember was the original boundary between North and South Korea. Now, this should have been the end of the war, right? Once South Korea was liberated from the communists, and again, it only took a few months, this should have been it. But MacArthur basically said, well, while I'm here, let's try to get the communists out of North Korea as well. So let's try to liberate the Korean Peninsula completely from communism. And fateful decision. And the U.S. wound up making its way deep into North Korea, basically defeating the communists as we were making our way through the north. Finally, we got to the Yalu River, which is in northern North Korea, which is right near North Korea's boundary with China. Now remember, China had just turned communist the year before, and China would not tolerate an American army on its border. So basically here, it would help if I had the map, but you'll see in that link I post for you. Here's North Korea, and here's China. So the thing is, we actually made our way close to the Chinese border, and China is not going to tolerate an American army on their border. And they warned the United States of that fact. Now, Douglas MacArthur actually said it's a bunch of hot air, saying that there's really no way that no way that the Chinese are actually going to enter the war. Well, as we were making our way deeper and deeper into North Korea, on November 25th, 1950, 300,000 Chinese troops poured over the border North and between China and North Korea and attack U.S. forces. So some of them were just attacking even unarmed. It was just basically like hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops charging at the United States as we were making our way to um, the North Korean Chinese border, and the fighting was intense and it was bloody between the United States and the Chinese. Now, Douglas MacArthur, now proven wrong completely, right? Because remember, he said it's just a bunch of hot air. There's no way that the Chinese are actually going to get involved in the war. And here, clearly, they did. So Douglas MacArthur asked for permission from President Truman to escalate the war, basically taking the war to China. So he proposed a blockade of the Chinese coasts, attacking Chinese cities, and implying, even though never specifically saying this, but implying that nuclear weapons actually should be used in China. So basically, a massive attack on China by the U.S. military. Um, Now, it was up to Truman to decide whether we're going to actually do this. Now, Truman refused because remember, China had just become communist and they were allied with the Soviet Union. So the thing is that getting involved in a huge war against China would potentially bring the Soviet Union into the war. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is all the military chiefs of staff together, the Army Chief of Staff, Navy Chief of Staff, Air Force, Coast Guard, Marines, all the chiefs of staff of the different branches of the military. That's the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff actually said about the idea of a war with China, it would be the wrong war at the wrong place with the wrong enemy. So basically advising Truman not to give MacArthur authorization to escalate the war into China. So Truman said no. We're not going to do this. And remember, the American system of government, the president is the commander in chief. The president is the one who makes military decisions. Douglas MacArthur then went public and criticized Harry Truman, his commander, and basically accused him of, well, not basically, he did accuse him of appeasement, saying that we have an obligation to escalate the war against China because China had actually gotten involved in the war against us. Interestingly, my AP US history teacher actually said, well, we should have, he was very conservative, and he actually said we should have done it. We should have actually escalated the war into China. But doing that would have really risked involvement by the Russians, and it could have meant World War III. And remember, the Russians now have nuclear weapons. So the thing is, after their successful detonation in 1949. So the thing is that this, well, I was going to say it was a risky strategy to go into China. It was beyond risky. It was extremely dangerous, almost irresponsible. So when MacArthur actually publicly criticized Truman, by giving newspaper interviews, by insulting Truman, Truman fired Douglas MacArthur for disobedience. Because remember, generals have to follow the president's orders. Douglas MacArthur was enormously popular, dating back to his performance in the Second World War. And the thing is that Truman was not very popular at this time. People, we'll talk about this later, but in subsequent lessons. But Truman, was criticized by almost everybody, by the left, by the right, by people who just thought he was, incompetent and ineffectual. So Truman was not very popular. So he's fired Douglas MacArthur, who is very popular. So it actually cost Harry Truman a lot of his remaining popularity by actually going after Douglas MacArthur and firing him in the way that he did. But it's very important to do that. He had to do that because a general cannot go public and start criticizing his commander-in-chief, right? That is so against the chain of command. But Douglas MacArthur was the type of man who always thought he knew everything and had all the answers, and and would be disobedient if he felt that he had to. Remember, Douglas MacArthur was the man who back in 1932 had actually gone after the bonus army. Remember those World War I veterans who marched on the Capitol asking for an early payment of their bonus. He basically ordered the U.S. military to go in and attack them with bayonets and gas. So yes, the same Douglas MacArthur. So you could see well, if you're being flattering, you're saying his boldness, but if you're not being flattering, you're saying his irresponsibility went back decades. Now, when MacArthur came back to the United States, he was given a ticker tape parade up Fifth Avenue, like when the Yankees win the World Series. That's the reception that Douglas MacArthur got when he arrived in New York City, and then he addressed a joint session of Congress. And he had the famous line at the end of the speech, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Um, and that, what exactly does that mean? And Truman was actually asked for his comment on that, and he said it was a bunch of damn bullshit. Truman, remember, did not suffer fools gladly. He told it like it was. And later on, when he had left the presidency, when he wrote his memoirs, Harry Truman was recounting the MacArthur episode, and he said, I didn't. I fired Douglas MacArthur because he didn't respect the authority of the President of the United States. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, even though he was. If that was a crime, three-quarters of the generals would be in jail. Yeah, that's very, very Harry Truman for you. But MacArthur became this legendary figure. Well, he already was, but he became an even more legendary figure after his firing during the Korean War among conservatives. He became like this iconic hero to a lot of them. But it was the correct decision. We have civilian control of the military in the United States, and war with China was just too risky. Now, the war continued after MacArthur's firing for almost 2 years, where basically we're fighting both the North Koreans and the Chinese. And the fighting was intense, it was bloody, and it was dragging on with no end in sight. The Truman ordered carpet bombing of North Korea, which was basically a massive aerial bombardment of the North in an attempt to try to get them to back down. And the war just basically was dragging on and on until 1953, when finally an armistice was declared between North and South Korea. And not an end to the war, but just basically a ceasefire. And that armistice has been in effect to this day. So it's been 67 years, and there still is officially no end to the Korean War. All we have is an armistice or a ceasefire. My father was in the Korean War. And the thing is that he was saying that the fighting was brutal. It's very, very cold in Korea for months out of the year. And the thing is that the United States was bogged down for so long with no end in sight. And he said he just remembered the cold, didn't really talk about the war that much. But one thing he said, like, before he passed away, he actually said this about being in Korea. He said, after Korea, I learned there's never anything in my life I'm ever going to worry about. Nothing could ever be that bad. So was a very profound statement there, I think, and I think even more because of the fact that uh, people kind of don't remember the Korean War. They call the Korean War the Forgotten War because it's sandwiched between World War II and Vietnam, which were these two wars that basically redefined American society, right? So Korea is just like a few years after World War II, and it's just kind of forgotten about, but it shouldn't be. 34,000 Americans lost their lives in the Korean War. It cost the United States $55 billion. Almost a million Chinese were killed in the Korean War. 800,000 Koreans were killed in the Korean War. So it's something that really should not be forgotten, but often is, just because it's sandwiched between World War II and Vietnam. But it was enormously costly and ultimately ended in stalemate. But did it? Um, a question you could ask is, did the United States win the Korean War? Well, it depends on how you define victory. If we define victory as in getting the communists out of South Korea, that absolutely happened, right? South Korea is now a thriving country. It's a great country. Right, it's a democracy. As a capitalist system, has a booming economy. It's a very well-run society. It's a great country, South Korea. So that there would not be a South Korea had it not been for the United States getting involved in the Korean War. So in that sense, it was a victory. But if we define victory as actually kicking the communists completely out of the Korean Peninsula, of you know of containing or he's stopping the growth of China. That did not happen, right? We did not defeat the North Koreans in North Korea, and we certainly did not defeat the Chinese. So I guess it depends on how you define victory. But it's a war that I think should be a lot more remembered than it actually is. There's a Korean War monument in Washington D.C. that was built because a lot of Korean War veterans were rightly saying that it's just not fair that the Korean War is just it's just so forgotten. We're still dealing with the legacy of the Korean War, right? All the problems that we have at North Korea, right, with this insane government that they have there as the worst country on earth, the worst government on earth, basically, that starves and imprisons its own citizens and is building a nuclear weapon, and is in many ways one of the greatest existential threats to the United States. That's certain. Its existence is certainly a legacy of the Korean War and our failure to actually get the communists out of the peninsula. All right, guys, very good. So I hope you enjoyed the new location. I'll probably do a lot of the videos from here, for a while until my back gets better, or I get a new chair, whichever comes first. So I'm going to leave in the bottom, of this video, the link to the map, which actually shows you Korea through stages, of the Korean War. All right. So I'll leave another video for you guys on Wednesday. I'm probably going to leave you a video documentary about the Korean War, so you can actually see some of it for yourself. So I will see you all in class on Thursday. All right. Peace.